Hey Rob,
Hey John, how's it going?
good. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, you know.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's good to see you. Good to see another human being, even
Yeah,
even if mediated technologically.
yeah. I think I was saying to you when we first emailed about this that one of the things that I'm missing the most, well, not quite as much as being able to make photographs right now, but just missing being able to get people over to the studio to talk about pictures. And you're one of my favorite people to talk to about it. So thanks for doing it again. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think it's true that conversation and dialogue are how thinking occurs. And during these days of quarantine, it's really important to maintain conversation as much as possible.
yeah,
Not only for our sanity, but for our practice as artists and thinkers.
yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that was so great in our last conversation was how much I left with new things to think about that I think impacted how the project has continued and how other pictures are coming along. So and maybe new stuff will come from this conversation too. Uh,
Hope so. Yeah.
so I think I mentioned that I've got a little kind of a slideshow that I can pull up here. Yeah, so this is the
Yeah.
cover. This is the cover of the book.
Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, this is a fragment of one of the pictures that I first saw when I first saw your work. I think, it was one of those things where people were starting to um, post news about it on social media saying, this is a show you have to see.
Yeah.
And so I walked down to your gallery and I was blown away
Mm.
by the shots, blown away by the images. And certainly this picture in particular did speak to me. Maybe can we move to the complete image?
Yeah,
Just to,
absolutely. Yeah, let me just scroll down here for a second. There we are.
and I think for me, what struck me was, maybe on the first level, just the kind of the beauty of the print and the color, the kind of um, the striking composition and planarity of this image, and all of that's just kind of basic aesthetic evaluation. But I think ultimately what really struck me was the kind of uncanniness of this image and so many of the images in the show and in the book, and
Yeah.
an uncanniness that I think is at the core based on a sense that this doesn't seem real. Like there's a kind of surreal aspect to this.
Yeah.
And I mean, in some ways, the surrealness has to do with a kind of surrealness that we associate even with other famous images of empty streets and empty storefronts that we associate with people like at J, for instance. But for me, I think, in our age of post-production and Photoshop, I couldn't believe that this was a straight photograph. Right? I couldn't believe that this was a photograph that wasn't in some ways not just altered in terms of some kind of color synthesis or or post production, but that you cut and paste. That was the part that I couldn't believe, that this was just found.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
not in some sense, this is a very familiar image, and that anyone who has been to a kind of town like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, a town that has, I think, certain art or photographic um, genealogy. You think of Walker Evans' photographs of Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Um, I know there are downtowns in the United States that look like this to a certain degree, but not so right, not so perfect in terms of their emptiness, or in terms of their kind of the way that, like this door, right? This door that is a glass door, and so it should be transparent, and yet, has the top half is covered with it seems like maybe painted lettering on the front of it, and then some kind of color cream back behind it, and then this giant cigarette ad in front of it, so that what should be a transparent um, plane has been totally occluded. And that just seemed too much. You know, there's a kind of over-determined, as we might say, aspect to these images. So
Yeah.
maybe just to say a little bit about your process, about, you know, how these are made.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, thanks for that. It's like such an interesting read of the picture. I mean, they're on some level, I feel like they have sort of one foot in that kind of early 20th century tradition that you talk about, where you know they're made with a large format camera on color negative film. I guess like one of the big things that happens while I'm in the presence of the thing that I'm photographing is I'm using a lot of those kind of movements that the large format camera has, you know, being able to manipulate both the front and back element of the camera. And historically, I think those movements have really been used to kind of quote unquote like correct for perspective shifts. Uh, but oftentimes I'm using them for the opposite purpose. So I'm often sort of torquing volume or torquing perspective or exaggerating things while, again, like while I'm looking at the subject in the camera. So there's a lot of decisions that are being made about where the focus is placed, and again, like how that sort of geometric and volumetric form is gonna render on that piece of film. And then you know, then that film is scanned. And there is a lot of work in Photoshop, and it's, you know, it's difficult and maybe a little geeky to go into the minutia of that, but I'll just say that you're right. Like there isn't any cutting and pasting, so nothing is being removed or put into the picture. But there is a lot of work to manage light and color, and so the kind of the vividness of the light, or the vividness of the way this subject kind of presents itself in the picture has a lot to do with all those kinds of decisions that I'm making when I'm working on the file on the computer, and then how it looks when it's finally, you know, spitting out of the printer. That's fun.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, that is another aspect of when I saw these in person, that the prints are meticulous and stunning, as are the reproductions in the book as well. I mean, that is part of the artistry of these works, is the printing of them. But maybe just to kind of take a step back. So in terms of the kind of the post-production that you're doing in terms of color and light, maybe we can just point to a few or an example in this image. I mean, for me, I think one of the things that's so striking is in that central passage of the door in the Marlborough ad, the way that the shadow just almost aligns with that triangular logo of Marlborough brand, right? That there's some kind of echoing between the found imagery, which is in some ways almost a photostat, or it's photography in some ways itself.
Yeah.
And then this light, and in the way it gets almost it reappears on the right-hand side in that blank, what seems to be a kind of old movie poster holder, where
Right.
you have another kind of oblique angle that
Yeah.
that follows that. Now that's probably something that was there in nature, but you've amplified, right?
Yeah, and I think the kind of placement of the shadows in the picture. It's funny because I mentioned to you I've been talking to some students about the work over the past month, and I've been talking. You know, I kind of referred to the shadows in the pictures as being placed, and I think a student mistook that for me having cut and pasted it again. But I sort of use that word really precisely, I think, because I'm thinking of, you know, because oftentimes I'm sort of scouting these locations and going back several times or waiting for the light to move. And so there is this kind of placement of the shadows in the picture where that kind of geometry that the light and shadow create become another kind of graphic like manifestation, so that in a way I'm sort of thinking about the entire world of the picture as being sort of sucked into that graphic space of advertising. So, you know, you picking up on the placement of that shadow and how it kind of lines up to the edge of that chevron of the Marlborough was definitely something that was intentional. I mean, the other thing I would say about the upper portion of this entire picture is you notice that there's a shadow there, but it's quite bright. And that's something that I'm also doing on the computer, and also kind of through exposure to kind of make those areas that might typically be very dark. And that would also create a kind of hierarchy of attention in a photograph. I'm sort of trying to dismantle that in a way and have those shadows be super open, so that in a way every part of the picture is kind of beckoning for attention.
Right, and that, I think that is absolutely part of it, that uncanniness that I felt, that these are real, and yet there's something that's not quite the way that one would see this with the naked eye. Yeah, again, going back to that wonderful right-hand corner with that strange, obsolete movie poster, which, maybe I should just say, in that tradition of the storefronts that we associate with photographers like J, people have also made the argument that these window displays that we'll see others in some of your images are kind of metaphors for pictures, right? They're things we look into. And there are also metaphors for desire, right? The sense that it's something we can see, but we can't touch because the glass prevents us from reaching it. And there's something about the kind of that sense that this old building may have once been associated with movies, that seems very important in this regard, that it was once a place of fantasy and illusion, but it's gone.
Yeah.
But I also want to just think about, so in that right-hand passage, because you've eased up, so to speak, on the shadows, we get that strange blue trapezoidal shape, and as well as you begin to read the space in front of you, or the space behind you as a photographer.
Yeah.
And it's, I like the way you described it as kind of trying to equalize the space in some ways, in the sense that, and this is where I think you must be working with the bellows of the camera a little bit, the way that the two sides between the doors seem equalized,
Right. Yeah.
So that, that seems to be, where it should be recessing, it seems to be popping up a little bit, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's, I mean, I think if you look at a picture like this, you can kind of tell that I'm, positioned a little bit left of center looking at this building. And so you can see that the left-hand side is a little bit closer to the camera than the right. But as you said, at the same time, it feels like that empty marquee area is sort of flipping forward in space. And that was definitely something that I was doing, when I'm making the picture, like I'm seeing that happen under the dark cloth. And, again, all of that, all those decisions in a picture like this was really about sort of setting up some kind of a relationship that could stay kind of complicated or complex between this sort of abundance of information that you see over on the left-hand side, and then this fully erased area over on the right, and sort of wanting them to kind of talk back and forth to one another, and maybe even nod to the kind of gradual, like, accrual of time on the surface of this building, which, as you said, was like, originally I think that was a movie theater, and so that sort of empty space on the left, or sorry, on the right hand side, I was thinking about it both as a nod to the past of this building, but then also potentially being about what, predicting what the future of this building might be. And it's funny because I've been back to this one maybe a year later, and it's just completely gone now. It's just all whitewashed. So
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just a few more details that I can't help but know. That one of the things that's so wonderful about all these images is your attention to surface. The way you have this kind of stainless steel door frame, and you can see the scratches. So again, all these places where time is registered in a material way, and of course the kind of strange gum stains on the sidewalk that appear throughout these images.
Yeah.
But then the two marble facades on either side of the door, right? On the right-hand side, you seem to have what seems to be a kind of singular piece of marble. And on the left-hand side, these square pieces. This idea that somehow architecture, these buildings were built in various campaigns, right? So to kind of talk about time in that way, that there's kind of these multiple campaigns that have some relation to one another, but maybe when they made the right-hand side, they couldn't get the same pieces as they had on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
this, you know, kind of vernacular architecture that doesn't seem to have a kind of a coherent identity, and yet still makes sense in a certain regard.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think for me, there, you know, that's even echoed in the two eights that are placed in the for the Christ. You know, that like there's the eight on the right is from a different typeface set, you know, than the one on the left, and it's also upside down. And I mean, I think, you know, again, both of those things that you're, you know, that you're pointing out, I guess for me are also, I mean, they go back to something that I have a lot of affection for, you know, in the landscape that I'm photographing, which is sort of people sort of trying their best with whatever they have available, you know, or and also this idea of um, a kind of accidental expression, you know, like a way that we might place something on a wall or make a decision about a material that can sort of say a lot about a certain kind of aspiration or a certain level of like resignment, you know, and I feel like those materials, as you said, can kind of talk about that in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I do want to talk about. Or maybe we should look at another photograph to continue our conversation, because
Sure.
that does, I mean, in some ways relate to one of the things I want to talk about, which is the way that these seem to be, you know, well, it was something I read this morning. There was something, maybe you saw it, published in Aperture magazine by Jeff Dyer about street photography in the age of quarantine.
Yeah.
And, you know, the difference between street photography and architectural photography, right? You know, these, I think, are not architectural photographs. And maybe they are in some ways not street photographs, but in the way that Dyer, citing John Sarkowski's discussion of an adjacent photograph of empty chairs in a cafe, suggests that there still are kind of intimations of the people who aren't there.
Right.
That somehow the absence of people is signified in these kind of images. And I do feel like these photographs are social portraits in a certain way. They're certainly portraits of a certain kind of vision of the United States, I think, for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And also, just before we move off of this picture, I mean, the other photographer that I thought about when making this picture was Judith Joy Ross. You know, I think it would probably be a stretch for me to say that I'm thinking about the photographs as a kind of portraiture, but I do want to think about each one of them as having this hyper subjective kind of vivid presence. And I think all the decisions that are going into like how the photograph is made and how it's produced is a way to really coax out this very, you know, unique kind of, subjectivity from these places that I think we typically just kind of walk past and don't pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, well, maybe, you know,
Oops.
Can we go to the one that says open, open, open?
Yeah, yeah.
That's another Marlboro ad, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Because for me, I mean, this maybe gets a little bit to what I'm thinking about is not only are they're certainly not portraits, but the way that they seem to almost hysterically address somebody, right? That they're trying to let somebody know, right? That door far on the left-hand side is open. And just even in the last image, the fact that you have the ad for the Marlboro, but then two other cigarettes and the open sign, there's something that's always kind of addressing the viewer, so that there is some kind of dialogue between these architectural surfaces and human beings, even if they're not present. I mean, maybe that's a little bit what I'm trying to get at. And yeah, for me, again, this is another one of these works that in some ways seems, you know, it's almost as if you took that the small open above Marlboro and then
just like
enlarged it,
cut
it open. You know, you try to imagine what the rationale behind these decisions were beyond just, again, a kind of, we could say, well, they made this first one and realized it wasn't big enough and had to make a second one and kept the small one. And then, of course, the strange kind of graffitied version on the right. But there's something that seems, again, uncanny and yet in some ways very mundane about what we're seeing in these images.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny to think about, or that one thing I thought about was repetition, and just sort of duplication, abundance, and maybe we'll talk about that when we get to the sequence of the book later. But in this picture, there was that initial recognition of the repetition of the word open. But I guess I started to even think about the repetition of the sort of chipboard facade, and the way that sort of splays out across the surface of the picture. And then even the fact that the building has somehow decided to duplicate the chevron, in this upside down manner at the bottom of the picture. So it's sort of like the picture becomes this whole world of repetition, and duplication. And I think, again, I think for a picture like this, it's very much about needing a certain level of attention in order to stay in business. It's like, I even see this now when, the limited amount of time that I'm driving around, seeing that places that aren't open just desperately want you to know, so that they can stay in business.
Yeah, no, there's a tremendous amount of pathos and desperation in these photographs. And again, that's where I can't help but see these in some ways as social portraits.
Yeah.
They're speaking to a certain condition of small town U.S. culture in the early 21st century. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
But maybe let's go to that, because the one you just showed with the red. That was another one that I just couldn't believe. Right? I just couldn't believe. This seemed too good to be true. This is something that one might stumble upon at an art museum. This doesn't seem like a facade.
Yeah.
And I have to, as I was preparing for our conversation this week, I've been taking walks around Lower Manhattan where I live, and you do come across 10 feet, 20 feet of city environments that have this kind of uncanny austerity. And this maybe speaks to another element of the kind of the fiction of your images, even though they are in many ways unadulterated in terms of their composition, the selection, right? Maybe just to speak a little bit about how you do, how much is the selection part of your creative practice, and how far do you travel to get these kind of images?
Yeah, I think that because the process of actually producing the photograph is so slow and kind of laborious, that the selection is a big part of it. And I would say that 60% of the time that I go through the process of actually making the photograph, I usually end up printing that photograph. And they're made in what I would say is like a sort of a U shape across the country, so up and down the east and west coasts, and then across the south. They're, I think there's a little over 70 pictures in the series right now, but I've been working on it off and on since 2012. So there's a lot of searching and a lot of deciding whether or not a picture is going to get made, and then once it's made, again deciding whether or not it's going to make it into sort of the final edit. And it is interesting that I feel like at the beginning of the project, I had this real clear idea of kind of where they were going to be located and the kinds of places that I was looking for. But just being out in the world more has really shifted that. And I feel like I'm sort of finding them kind of anywhere now, or finding the potential for a picture sort of anywhere. This is something that, this picture in particular, it has like so few of the hallmarks of what I thought the project was going to be at the beginning. So you're not, there isn't a lot of signage. There aren't a ton of, clear examples of like how the building has been produced or changed sort of over time. But there is something about like the kind of emptiness that you see in the picture. Again, the way that the building itself seems to want to really advertise that empty presence. So much so that if, one thing that I thought about a lot in this one was on that right-hand side, the way that the little bit of brick that you can see um, makes you sort of realize that that part of the building is sort of leaning forward a little bit. So the top right of that picture is larger than the bottom right. And that has to do with, again, the decision I'm making the camera, sort of wanting that building to just subtly lean forward to kind of address the viewer.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a way that it has a kind of pictorial effect that we associate with abstract painting.
Yeah.
There's this kind of sense. I mean, beyond again just the kind of gorgeousness of the color, there's something about the way that the space, as you just described it, works, that it invests what seems to be a rather empty composition with a certain kind of affect, right? It does have some kind of feeling to it, and I think that that's very much the way you just described it.
Yeah.
It's more than just a kind of cool composition.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I think that that's also like something that I had to really reckon with, like as the pictures, started to build up, was certainly the relationship that they have to other kinds of pictures that are made of similar subjects, both historically, but also even like things that you might find on the internet or on certain Instagram accounts and things like that. But I think I really wanted to foreground, as I hope the work does, like the people that are kind of behind all of these facades, or the people that are building them, or the people that interact with them, and sort of figuring out a way to make the photograph be a kind of embodiment of a certain set of desires and challenges that that I guess we certainly were experiencing before this happened, and in a way I feel like the pandemic has sort of accelerated a lot of those things.
Yeah, I mean, this is a photograph of a painting in a certain way.
Yeah.
Willem de Kooning famously began his career, or at least had a day job as a house painter while he was painting, beginning his career as an artist. And that one small passage in the large red where you see a little bit of a kind of lighter hue or something has been covered over, right? It reminds you that this is ultimately a photograph of somebody who had painted a surface. In the same way, so you're dealing with a kind of form of painting and a form of architecture that are not considered art. In the same way, of course, that photography has always had this strange relationship between modes of photographs that are not art.
Yeah, and I think too that even the way that the photographs are made and how I'm thinking about them, they sort of the work sort of sits in between these two kinds of approaches that we think about as being really separate in a lot of contemporary photography. And one is this sort of unmediated sort of an extension of the documentary style, and then the other is something that is hyper manipulated, hyper aware of itself. And I think one of the things that's been really exciting as these pictures have come together is finding this place where I'm really trying to kind of explore a certain method of depiction that has its one foot in both ways of making, and one in both ways of seeing. So I'm sort of thinking about the idea of the photograph certainly being a kind of a record of something that existed, but within that there is so much room for invention and for subjectivity to enter into the process.
Which, of course, is what Walker Evans would call documentary style to a
Right.
certain degree.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, that's right. Every photograph, to a certain degree, always is documentary. It always does register some reality. And these do. As I said, I think that's part of the charge of these, is that there's something familiar for those who have traveled in the country.
Yeah.
They recognize these, and yet it's part of, I think, the artistic vision to isolate these aspects of the environment and bring them into focus. And I think this goes to what I was saying before, is as I've been walking around New York, I've been seeing small layers in the city, right? And that's what, you know, artists in some ways, that's what they do, is they allow us to see things that were, you know, materially there, but in some ways not perceptible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. Do you want to look at one of the other single images, or should we maybe
Let's talk about the, why don't we go through
the sequence?
sequence, because we haven't talked about the sequence. You know, we are talking about this book.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think sequencing is a major component of what it means to make a photo book.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to, you know, maybe we can just kind of quickly walk through the sequence, this one section of the book, which is if I'm not mistaken, here I have my copy here.
Yeah.
It starts with a blank. You know, you kind of
Oh yeah.
give a little rest, right? There's an open double layout,
Yeah.
blank pages,
Yeah.
and then we have just this one image, right?
Yeah, and then it goes to this.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, that's important in the sense that it really announces that this is the start of something new, and there's a kind of theme. And so this very strange, again, you know, a wonderful kind of image that again seems unbelievable in its uncanny redundancy, right? So what is, again, when I see this, I think, okay, the artist took these bricks, rescaled them, and pasted it, and then but then you kind of see on either side of these large columns of bricks, this is a pattern that you've isolated in a certain way.
Yeah, no, this is just a sort of a covered walkway at a shopping center in the Central Valley in California, and you know, but it did seem to me like this. I mean, there is an absurd amount of bricks here, like the idea of again, that idea of repetition or duplicating something. It seems to be taken to this almost like illogical extreme, and you know, I do think that putting this picture at the beginning of this section was sort of wanting to foreground really those two things. One was the idea of repetition, or this idea of abundance, or the illusion of abundance, that I think is like so central to a certain kind of capitalism and desire, or the desire that goes into capitalism. But also just absurdity, and sort of wanting to have those two things kind of exist. You know, I think there's, as you mentioned, there's the kind of pathos in the pictures, and I think there's also a kind of whimsy that can happen. So yeah, sort of starting with that blank spread was really a way of insisting upon a kind of emptiness, a kind of lack, not a kind of austerity, but just like an uncomfortable absence, right? And then shifting over to this picture that's very much about a lot of things, you know, being reproduced, and then that, you know, that goes into the next slide where we see the it's almost like the bricks have transformed into dollar bills here, and they're kind of spread out. And you know, it's interesting when you were talking about the prints before, that one of the things that I noticed when I was making the work was that a lot of the signage that I'm photographing is actually printed on an inkjet printer. So there's this kind of there's a relationship between the physical photographs that I'm printing and then the stuff that I'm responding to. And I think there's something about the inks in my inkjet printer that are really capable of reproducing that hypersynthetic kind of color that exists in that kind of world of advertising. So I think, again, like Morgan and, you know, the folks at the printing house were really able to kind of coax out those colors in a great way when we were printing. But yeah, I mean, I think this picture too, like that idea of like the duplication or the suggestion of abundance, but then you read the door and it says no cash on premises. It's like, so it's sort of the rug gets kind of pulled out from under you.
Yeah, I mean, this image, and there's so many of them that include photomechanical imagery in the store windows, suggests that somehow our whole urban environment, our whole cultural environment, has become photographic to a certain degree. Like the photography has become what we see as we walk through the city, so much so that even those bricks that preceded this image are photographic, right? That
Yes.
they, in their repetition, in the planarity,
Yeah.
in their strange uncanniness, you know, in
Yeah.
the even in the kind of way that photography always rescales things, or
Yeah.
typically rescales things, so that even things that are not um, inherently photographic somehow bear the trace of it. And that's again that kind of strange, uncanny blurring between simulation and reality that I think runs through all of your work.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's true. Yeah, you know, that's right. You know, that here's this handful of cash, and there's no cash on premise. So, you know, if there ever was a kind of epitomization of the false promises of the store window,
Yeah.
this is it. Yeah, there's a profound literalization that occurs in this image.
And I think, you know, the other thing about, you know, what you said so eloquently about like the sort of photographic being manifested in the landscape. I mean, another thing that I'm thinking about is the fact that, you know, I just feel like we're experiencing the physical world in a much different way over the last, you know, 15, 20 years. Partially because we're walking around with all these digital devices in our hands, in our pockets, and just that awareness of of that thing almost as like an extension of our body and its immediate connection to other images and ways of engaging with commerce. You know, I do think it changes how we interact with physical space. And you know, one of the things I thought about as I was putting these together and trying to figure out how to make the pictures and how to make them look physically as prints was, you know, again, like how to make the pictures be kind of an embodiment of that. And maybe that's where some of that uncanniness that you're talking about comes from. This one is, I always feel like it's good to point out because some people miss it, that this was a little shop that made t-shirts. And so it's very subtle in the reproduction, but you can see the outlines of these t-shirts kind of superimposed over the American flag decal there. So
Oh,
it's not just the flag that's being reproduced, it's also this form of a t-shirt.
oh, I didn't recognize that at first. Yeah, that
Yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah.
and that, just another layer of replication, and in some ways another layer of vulgarization, right? This kind of sense of taking something that has a kind of high and haughty rhetoric and bringing it down. You know,
Yeah,
architecture to this,
yeah,
the flag to a T-shirt. I think that's, you know, a common theme throughout these images.
yeah. And I mean, it almost felt like, I mean, in this one, I think there was something, it almost felt like a circus clown or something like that when I was photographing it. Again, that repetition there, and the kind of zaniness of the way that they were all placed in the windows, and that was something that I really wanted to kind of reinforce through the way the color was rendered. And I think that that blue has a lot to do
Yeah,
with that. Yeah.
right. Exactly. It just, you know, so in some ways we've moved from the repetition to the bricks, the
Right.
repetition of the dollars, the American flag, and
Yeah.
now kind of repetition of actual things.
Yes.
So it's almost like part of the magic is, okay, you think this is, you know, that this is purely just a trick of mechanical reproduction, but
Right.
here we have objects, which of course might have their own industrial forms of replication in the
Sure.
at their basis, but you know, something about this that almost it substantiates the kind of magic that we've been watching for the last 3 or 4 images,
Yeah. Yeah. And I
and
think,
it grounds it in something much more industrial, right?
yeah.
Even the kind of the bricks here, and it just seems from a different age in some ways.
Yeah, and I think I'll just flip forward for a second that it was important for me to put this one, you know, right before the Empire picture, you know, because I feel like sort of going from this, which is such a kind of a performance of a kind of patriotism, to this one, which I think does nod to a, you know, a kind of industrialized past that the country mythologizes a lot, right? And then going to the Empire picture, um, which is so much about the fall of an empire, or the end of an empire, or the end of a certain kind of moment. Um, you know, again, the shadow of this one was really important. I remember waiting for the moment when that shadow just touched, you know, where the ground met the facade of the wall there. So it almost feels like the shadow is sort of pinning down the word empire. This is another one because there's a few, you know, we just went through a few where the shadows didn't play a huge role, and then it sort of comes back in this photograph.
It's true. I mean, yeah, often when I'm reading novels, and I think it's equally true for photo books, and I often tell this to my students, I always say, pay attention to the first sentence, or pay attention to the first image. And you know, for me, it's that Marlboro logo with the triangle, and it does reappear throughout these images, and even the trapezoid, maybe even more than the triangle. You know, that there's something, and if I was going to think more deeply about this body of work, I'd want to think about, I'd want to talk to a mathematician, talk about triangles and trapezoids, think about their kind of rhetorical effect, because I think, you know, there's something, even the base where the empire, right? It's not a rectangle, it's not a triangle.
No,
it's this very strange kind of trapezoidal parallelogram shape that you know, you set into motion. It's really a very complex geometrical space. And I think there's something about that that really is, and I guess some of that is, again, through your own work in the bellows of the camera, making
sure.
that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's like the best way I've been able to describe it is like sort of torquing, you know, or twisting volume in the pictures. Yeah.
And I mean, for me, this one is one of these moments where you have that sense of space that you've been talking about, where the space is projected back out beyond the camera, where you see the sky. And is that like a window from a building on the other side of the street that's being reflected?
No, I mean, that's just the sky there. And then what you're seeing through is there's another kind of strip mall behind me. And then, you know, I think when you look at the book, right above the word phone, you can see the American flag. There's an American flag hanging inside of that building. So again, that's just like, if we sort of go backwards here, there is this sort of section or this part of the book here where I'm thinking about that red, white, and blue thing, and thinking about America and the empire, and then wanting to kind of have that be present but also absent when you get to this phone applications picture.
Yeah, I mean, the phone is such a leitmotif throughout your book. I mean, in the cover, right, with Bethlehem Wireless, it's there at the beginning, you know, in a sense that it seems to be, and maybe in one level, the phone has become the primary camera for most people these days, but it also, you know, speaks to a kind of both connectivity, but also a kind of a form of alienation. You know, it's why people aren't on the streets, perhaps, to a certain degree.
Yeah. And I think there's also, you know, it does point to, you know, this really basic need to connect. And I think that's another thing that happens in a lot of the places that I'm photographing, is there is a kind of connection that can take place, particularly in a lot of these sort of small town, independently owned places. You know, while there is a lot of absurdity going on, I think that comes from a certain kind of system that we're all living inside of. But the basic kind of desire to engage in a kind of commerce and to relate to one another, there is something kind of sweet about that, in a way that I also want to be in the pictures, or that I'm hoping I can sort of pull out. You don't see it as much in a photograph like this, but I do think like that word phone, or this idea of connecting, the wireless thing, is also a way of sort of talking about the kind of connection that can happen in some of these places.
There's something quaint about this one in the sense that it doesn't have an area code.
Right. Yeah.
Which, who encounters a 7-digit phone number these days?
Yeah, well, I think that's another thing too, is that I feel like when you get to some of these like hyper local places that I'm photographing, they're so intrinsically tied to the community that they're in, that it seems like there's no need, you know, to put the area code in, because everyone sort of knows it. Everyone's going to encounter this, lives in Arizona, and they know that that's, what the area code is in this particular neighborhood. Yeah.
It's also just, I think, again, a sign of this kind of non-synchronous aspect of architectural facades.
Yeah.
Right? That this was probably made in an era where that wasn't as much as crucial,
Right.
but it stays up, and I think these kind of multiple temporalities that are all frozen
Yeah.
onto the facades that you're capturing, capturing
Right.
synchronously through the camera.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this one also, just to go back to the sequencing thing, begins to kind of reiterate that duplication or the repetition again with the squares on the facade here, and then of course that gets extended to the next few pictures in the sequence.
Right.
That begins with the dollars. Yeah.
This is the conclusion of the section, right? The dollars and the coins. Or is that right, or is there one after that?
There's
the dollars.
You flip the page. There's the coins on the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And so to me, it's a beginning with the bricks. If we can recall the bricks now have almost turned into dollars, right? So if on some level, that was always kind of there, and it becomes explicit at the end. To me, that's just a really brilliant piece of sequencing in the sense that you really are making an argument or making a kind of you're expressing something pictorially through the sequencing of these images. That of course relates to images beyond, before and after this, but it's a really wonderful example of how photo book sequencing can produce meaning.
Yeah.
Or at least be suggestive of certain things.
Yeah, and I think, just to go back to your point about the kind of photographic, or the idea of the reproduction being manifested sort of in the world, like another thing that I thought about that's hard to see on the screen here, but you certainly see it in the book that's in front of you, was just having these pictures be on the same sheet of paper, just on one, on opposite sides of the same sheet. It's almost as though the bills sort of bleed through the other side and become coins on the other side. So there's this way that the book itself kind of holds some of that stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's worth just saying the binding of this book is wonderful. It's got what is the technical word to describe that?
To add it later. Yeah.
But it gives it a certain kind of architectonic form. It also, of course, allows it allows the pages to open up so that you do really read this as a kind of image within a blank space, which I think is part of its power for sure.
It really was important from the get-go that we wanted the book to lay super flat. I think for that reason, but also there's a kind of play with flattening in all the pictures too, and it seems like this that binding like really allows you to engage with that in an interesting way. Yeah, Swiss binding it's called. I just remember.
Is there one more image? I think we had one or two more that we were going to talk about.
Yeah, let me scroll down. There was I think there's three. So there's this one, and this one.
Oh, right. Yeah, let's let this one, maybe we can talk about a little bit, just because I think this related when you're talking earlier about the fact that your printer is using, in some ways, the same inks that are used for so much commercial packaging and so much commercial signage.
Yeah.
For me, this image is so powerful in the way that it does seem to make this affinity between the kind of multiple uses of photography beyond art, which of course most photography is used beyond art.
Yeah.
And here, of course, it's shown the kind of ephemerality and the kind of color change that occurs from light, that when photographs are left in the sun. So this sense of time is so vividly portrayed through color in this image. No, we all know that look.
Yeah, it's true. Like there is something about the way that color can carry meaning in a picture like this because of our kind of collective understanding of what that means. And I think it turns out that sort of cyan that you're seeing there is sort of the least fugitive of all the colors that are used in commercial printing. So it's the last one to go. And so
Right.
when all this stuff has been placed in the window for all these years, everything else seems to have faded except for that layer of cyan. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I think I loved recognizing all of the kind of product photography and graphic design that I'm looking at in each of these individual little pictures that sort of make up the larger window, but also just thinking about the way that they're just sort of really pressed up against the glass, kind of rushing up. It's as though the whole store is so jam-packed with these things and it's about to sort of burst open. But also this idea of, again, like beckoning for a kind of attention. And this one was like so interesting and fun to work on because I was also sort of thinking again about that space on the right hand side, which is an entrance to the store to the right. And again, wanting to set up this kind of tension between that sort of scarcity that you see on the right hand side and that just like vast abundance that you see on the left.
Yeah, and of course it also flattens the space so that the kind of flat that you just described, the flat pressing of these objects up against the window is somehow bleeds into what should be a recessive space, but everything seems to be pushed up. And again, to me, that gives these images, you know, there's a pathos to them, but there's also a kind of hysterical component, right? That
Absolutely.
that they're trying to get your attention in a way that seems beyond the mundaneness of the subject matter.
For sure. Yeah.
I mean, we should probably talk a little bit about the title of your book, right?
Sure.
The Island Position.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah, the title comes. It's a term that's used in print advertising. That it means that you have an ad that doesn't have to compete with other ads. So it's an ad that's only surrounded by editorial content. I mean, as I continued to work on the pictures and was starting to think about what a title might be, I started to think about the role of advertising, and that, you know, as we've been talking about, that the pictures show not only what's advertised as being for sale inside of the stores, but they also, I think, inadvertently advertise all these sort of idiosyncratic decisions that went into the creation of these places. So I started to think about the entire space of the photograph as a kind of advertisement. It seems like the kind of photography that I'm practicing in the project is so much about a kind of isolation, and sort of pulling each one of these places out of that kind of competitive flux of the street, right? That I wanted, that it seemed like a natural way to kind of talk about them. And so that's where the title kind of came from. Yeah.
With that in mind, we can look at the umbrella in the window display.
Yeah, speaking of islands, yeah.
Because that does seem, you know, if there was an island position,
Right.
this might be it. You know, it's kind of, I mean, to me, this is the great example of the window display as fantasy.
Yes.
Right, and window display as pictorial. You know, that someone has created this image that you're supposed to look at like a painting. You know, again, to suggest that there's something about this that is a kind of vernacular folk tradition of creation that's not respected by the art world and yet exists across a wide spectrum of practices.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, like, you know, I think for me, this one, it was so important that this is it's the only picture in the whole series that shows a bit of actual sky, not a reflection of the sky. So
Oh yeah.
so if you look at that upper left-hand corner, there's this little strip of sky that I sort of included, and I really wanted to kind of set up this relationship between the sort of high fantasy of what's going on inside that window, and then the reality of the real blue sky that sort of surrounds the scene. Yeah.
I don't know if I picked up on that before, and it's true because this is one of the few store windows that is transparent. It's not covered with imagery, so you can
Yeah.
see it, and I think we could say that what is shown is not for sale either.
Yeah, it was unclear to me when looking at this place what was going on and what was for sale. Yeah,
Yeah, maybe
uh,
so.
but no, it does. I mean, in a way, it almost felt like some sort of a little miniature installation, put in
Absolutely.
this window. And I think you're right to think about it as a kind of vernacular kind of art form that seems to be kind of performing inside of the space of the picture.
And one that shows a kind of wonderful sensitivity to color. You know,
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think again, for me, like just loving that relationship between the bricks on the bottom right hand corner and the whoever's decided to paint that red on the left hand wall inside the window, the play of green of like the astroturf and then the green of the facade and of course the two blue chairs and then going up to the sky. I mean, I think like that's another thing that I thought about a lot with the way that color operates in all of the pictures is that it on the one hand, in a kind of almost in like a really modernist way, I'm sort of thinking about creating a kind of coherence like through the color and creating a kind of almost like an ecosystem inside of the picture where everything is sort of related to everything else. But at the same time, that is often like coupled with the the kind of like visual and volumetric play that we've been talking about in some of the other pictures that makes the place feel both sort of real and imagined. And like I guess the hope for a lot of these too is that the beginning or the setup of the picture is something that feels like very kind of vibrant and almost sort of hyper optimistic. But then the longer you look at the picture, you realize that something else is often at play.
yeah, and I mean, and now I'm looking at that left-hand corner with the sky, but also what seems to be a wall of small bricks
Yeah,
below it.
yeah,
And I mean, another aspect of the book that's so powerful is that it creates a sense of a world unto itself. Again, that I think one can begin walking around cities and see passages like this, but they're always, right next to this might be a very modern building, or in
yeah,
fact, a kind of 19th century brownstone.
yeah, that's
But
right.
it's your selection of these. There's a kind of homogeneity
Yeah,
to your selection that makes it seem like that wall is that wall that we saw with perhaps the $100 bills. Like this is all one world that's somehow connected. That's the effect not only of your vision as a photographer, but their situation in the book. Right? It
mm,
creates this world into itself.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
and
mean,
then when I didn't know the advertising connotations of the island position, but for me, in this image, there's something slightly, um, you know, island-like about it, and it's summery beach scene. For me, there's something about the island that's about a kind of figure of isolation as well, and that the island is set apart from everything else, and that just as one can imagine these kind of urban environments being places that somehow the contemporary world of cell phones
right.
hasn't quite reached entirely, right?
Yeah,
It hasn't caught up with the
yeah,
21st century modern world. They're these islands that have been protected in some ways. So the island is isolation, but it's also security in some
right.
ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also like it can also be this place that holds a kind of mirage, you know what I mean, or a promise of something, in the case of this one, there's like that the kind of transcendence that happens when you look inside that inside that glass. Yeah, I mean, just thinking about the title again and the kind of attention that I'm wanting to give to each thing. Um, for me, that also has to do with a certain kind of just. I think I may have said it already, but I'll say it again. That it has to do with a certain kind of affection that I feel for them, you know what I mean, as subjects, and for the communities that I think they're connected to. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
this is another one that I just couldn't make heads or tails of when I
yeah,
first saw. So maybe even just describing what
sure.
we're seeing, how this was
Yeah,
made.
yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think, when you're working like this, I say this to my students a lot, when you're working this way as a photographer, if you've kind of committed to a certain kind of system and how you're photographing, you can't really invent something. But I do think it can be really helpful to kind of imagine pictures, imagine things that you'd like to encounter or things that you feel are missing from a project. And just a thought that was occurring to me at this point when I was making the pictures was like, what does the storefront see? So I'm sort of thinking about myself observing that space, but sort of wondering like, what does that space look at? Like, how does it see outwardly? And this picture came along. I was in a small sort of shopping center, strip mall area, and this was like a small electronics store, but it's just the side of the building. And the owner, I guess, had placed this mirror-like material in the window so that you couldn't see inside. So it's looking across the street basically, and so it's this building that's looking across to at a Wendy's, at like a at a just a little takeout place, and that's why everything is backwards in the mirror there. But it was also kind of mind-boggling to me to see that hyper kind of almost like brutalist form of like facade treatment that you see on the left-hand side was also repeated on the Wendy's right behind me. So it just sort of seamlessly, like the real world and the represented world kind of merge in this really intense way in that part of the picture. So,
Yeah, in the sense that, again, there's kind of this strange kind of coherence to the world where, everywhere you think, everywhere you go, you're going to find this. There's this kind of logic of repetition
right.
is
Yeah.
going to continue these bricks or these kind of architectural details across space. I mean, the other thing, as you said, these spaces, these buildings looking at one another. A detail I didn't notice in the last image we just saw was that beach ball had a starfish with sunglasses on it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's again a kind of uncanny sense that even that storefront is looking out. Again, the way that all ads kind of address people, right?
Of course.
Saying,
Yeah.
you buy this, we're open late.
Right. Yeah.
That aspect, I think, is something you're picking up on. That if they're not portraits, they have a kind of anthropomorphic
Mm,
aspect, in the sense that they're addressing us.
yeah, for sure.
Constantly.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, maybe we can end by, picking up on something you said, which is maybe not as evident to people who will look at these images and see the book, which is, I think, your generous, appreciative attitude, not only, as you said, to the people who live here, but to the spaces themselves. That there is a kind of aesthetic, and pathos is one word. But one could also just say that there's a kind of how do you describe it? These are maybe one way to put this is the question of, and this is okay. Let me start over.
Yeah, yeah.
I think with so much street photography, or so much photography that's outside of the studio,
Yeah.
the question of the creation of the artist and the creation of what is being photographed is always not entirely clear, right? Are we admiring the beauty of a tree in a park, or the beauty of a human or an animal? Or are we admiring the beauty that the photographer brings to the portrayal of those subjects? And I think that's again, this maybe gets back to that, to me, the kind of primal uncanniness of these images. That, am I admiring the ingenuity of whoever decided to put that 8 upside down, right? That was that just carelessness, or was someone kind of trying to express something about the condition of being in Bethlehem circa 2018?
Yeah.
Or is it your manipulation of the image, even as simply as cropping or what you frame in the viewfinder.
Right.
And I mean, so I bring that up just to suggest that, I mean, I think it's worth noting that your selection of these subjects does, I think, suggest a certain appreciation and you know, admiration for just the way that these things look.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that, yeah, I mean, that the way things look means something, you know, and that,
Yeah, that's right. There's
yeah,
an intelligence to them.
yeah. And I think that there is, when we're living in, you know, the time that we are, there does seem to be something going on in them where, you know, one single owner or multiple owners are almost like speaking through the language of advertising, like that's their form of public address, or that's one form of public address, is to kind of engage with that. Again, whether, you know, in some pictures you can see it in a more accidental way, in other pictures you can see it in a super intentional way. But I also do see that as being totally related to what it's like to be a photographer, right? That we're not completely in control, or for this kind of photography, that I'm not completely in control, no matter how much I want to be. And then all these other things sort of slip in, whether they're my own, you know, my own subjectivity, or whether they're certain kinds of quirks or biases that I have. So I think there's also a relationship to how I work. But it also made me think, as you were describing the tree and the park and the artist, it made me think about that great line from John Tchaikovsky. He was talking about Walker Evans, and he said that, I think he says, like, it's impossible to know whether Evans recorded the era of his youth or invented it.
Right.
And I think that relationship between sort of documentation or pseudo documentation and invention is sort of at the heart of a lot of the work, and what, for me, what ties it to fiction, and particularly like speculative, like fiction. And yeah.
Right. That someday we will look back and say, this is what a certain swath of small town America looked like. And of course, that's not true at all.
Right.
And yet it still captures some truth to
Right.
the way that the cities looked like, but even more so, what it was like to be alive then, right? What was it like to be alive in a world where we were inundated with a certain kind of advertising and promises, and a world on the cusp of being, you know, overrun with telecommunications, right? I think that's, again, one of these themes that as it becomes increasingly ubiquitous, will probably not have as much signage, right? The signage has something to do with that kind of crucial moment of its emergence and dominance.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
do think that a big part of the work too is sort of witnessing a kind of a huge transition from a certain kind of physical commerce to something that's a lot more virtual. And of course, like, this moment that we're in has thrown all of that into, like, really, you know, really stark relief. But, you know, I do wonder, like, as time goes on, how many of these kinds of places are just going to be gone. And I think it, you know, it used to be that we would say that the big bad or the danger was like the big box store, but I even wonder about those things, like, it, you know. And there is something for me, not that I find a Marlboro sign particularly beautiful. There is something that's lost in that, I think, when we have this idea of a kind of a landscape that we've kind of grown used to, and both in its visual form, but also in the way that we interact with one another physically there. Like, you know, it's interesting to think about, like, what happens when that goes away, and what's lost when that goes away.
That might be a good place to end, don't you think?
Probably, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground,
We did.
and you know, I always learn a lot talking to you, and even more so every time I look at these pictures, I see new things, and they make me think about new things. And to me, that's the greatest testament of their kind of intelligence and beauty is that they continually reveal new insights, and you know, more than anything, they're just I continually want to look at them, which is I think the highest compliment I can give to any kind of picture, is that you know, every time I look at them, I keep wanting to look at them. I don't want to stop looking at them, and so I appreciate you continuing our conversation and talking to me about it.
It's been
But
so.
maybe you should say that to me. I think you should
Yeah.
cut back. You should say that sounded like I was the one who was the host of this. So but you can keep the compliment.
Yeah.
And, yeah, you should have the last word.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, it has been, but it has been so great to talk to you about them, and I just can't thank you enough for how generous you've been with your time and your observations, and yeah, thanks so much, Rob.
Well, I hope next time we can do it in your studio, in person,
With a beer.
with a beer, yeah,
It'll happen. Yeah.
or some ice cream and phone cards.